All right, everyone, I have Troy Duell here, and I'm super excited to talk to him because he actually was in the pharmaceutical industry for over 20 years. And if you guys have been listening for a long time, you know that I hardly ever go to the doctor and try to avoid any pharmaceutical drugs if at all possible. So when they reached out to me to have him on, I'm like, how did this guy who was in the pharmaceutical industry end up diving into these deep health issues and finding another need there? So I'm super excited to talk to him because, like I said, after being in the pharmaceutical industry, he realized that there was a lot for profit over health and that products were expensive, not really effective, and could even be harmful. So I'm super excited to dive into this conversation with him today. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Absolutely excited to be here and share a little bit about what we've been able to learn the last 10 years or so. So super excited about it.
So I'd like to ask before we dive into some of the topics that we have outlined, how did you make that jump, I guess, from obviously like you saw that there was the profits over the maybe necessarily need or health, but what made you actually step away and turn gears, I guess?
Yeah, it's a great question and one I get a lot, but I think really as I was in the middle of it, we were doing a lot of good things, and there are companies out there that do a lot of good things, but you begin to see with everything, there are some bad things that come along with it. And one of the things that we saw was the cost was kind of hidden from patients. So insurance is a good thing for all of us, but it hides us from the true cost of what people can charge or what people even have to pay really for the pharmaceuticals that they're getting. And then a lot of times, as you started studying, you found that there were vitamins and natural remedies that could take place over those pharmaceutical substances. And really for me, it came down to my wife and I had our first child about 5 years into marriage and thought, hey, we're about to start the American dream. I have that 2 kids, 3 to 4 years apart. And we started the process of having our second child, and we couldn't get pregnant. And like a lot of your listeners, I'm sure, just suffering through that, you go through the fertility treatments, you go through the frustrations of timing and just not getting pregnant. And finally, the doctor sat my wife down and said, look, you'll never get pregnant. And if you do, you won't have a normal child and he won't be healthy. And from my mindset, I started thinking, well, what can we do? What was our role in this, if there was any role at all for us to kind of go down that path? And that's what got me into a lot of the fertility things that we can control, and then understanding the things that we couldn't control, but finding pieces that you could add to the puzzle to help you overcome some of those things within fertility in particular.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know that there are so many people struggling with that right now, and that like you said, there is some things in your control and then there is some out of your control as well. So it is very helpful to learn, okay, what can I be doing? And I know as parents, that's something that we always strive for, right? We're like, okay, how can we best protect our children? What can we do? But then you have a kid and you're like, wow, I'm realizing there's so much out of my control. Like this entire world is out of my control. So what can I do? And so I love that you touched on that, because there is 2 sides, and it is really hard for some people who are like, oh, well, just get healthy and then you can have a baby. Sometimes the issues are much deeper than that. And there's things in your control and then there's things out of your control. So I'm hoping that there's a happy ending to what you're saying.
there definitely is a happy ending, and didn't get there, but we ended up kind of going through that process, obviously wrestling with a lot of things. My wife and I prayed for a long period of time and finally decided, you know what, we're going to adopt, and went through that process. About a year into it, got all our paperwork done, sent that paperwork overseas to get a little girl from China, and found out the day that we sent off the paperwork that we were pregnant with our second son. So now we've got 2 great kids, 2 great sons, and a beautiful little daughter that we got from China. So our family was ultimately completed, and but it also launched me down that path of finding what was it that allowed us to get pregnant after the doctor said there was no way that this could happen.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of where the process really started rolling for me to move away a little bit from the pharmaceutical world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, a couple of things that we have outlined today, we're going to touch on a couple different supplements and kind of dive into some prenatal stuff, because for the longest time, one of the biggest things that they would say is you have to get folic acid, you have to get folic acid. And you can even see that now in so many products that there's added folic acid in it. And now I've even heard, which I don't have any basis on which to say this, so don't whatever, that there could even be like a link between over too much folic acid and ties, like tongue ties, lip ties, things like that. And I'm like, that's interesting, because I've always done folate, and both my kids have lip and tongue ties. But it was just like super interesting. So I'd love to kind of dive in the folic acid versus folate.
Yeah, and that's a great question. As a matter of fact, it's amazing when you even talk to physicians, they don't realize that folic acid is different than folate, which is different than folinic acid. There are actually three forms of folate that are out there that we know of. It's folic acid, methylfolate, and folinic acid. Two of those are from nature. So methylfolate and folinic acid are from nature, and folic acid was synthetic. They actually made it in a lab in the 50s. And to your point, what has happened with all this fortification that happened in 1996, for me, and I'm sure for you, as you were growing up, there were fewer people that you remember having all these allergies and asthma and everything else in your class. But kids today, that is really commonplace. And they came out with a study from the Allergy and Asthma Institute, the American Allergy and Asthma Institute, 2 years ago, 2019, that showed food allergies and asthma were actually linked to folic acid and folic acid intake. So you see some linkage to allergies, you see linkage to asthma, and you've seen linkage to several other things. You mentioned one that I wasn't familiar with, which is the tongue tie piece, but there are all kinds of things that are starting to pop up now because of folic acid. If you look at everything we eat, bread, pastas, any cookies, really any processed food that they're adding to, they do that for neural tube defect, trying to prevent neural tube defects. And that was the idea and the intent behind it. But like everything else that comes out with wonderful ideas and intent, you have some unintended consequences. And that's one of them. They've also linked it to increased in breast cancer, colon cancer, and even prostate cancer in men. So we're seeing some of these side effects come up that maybe we shouldn't be taking so much folic acid in. There are actually certain studies that suggest our bodies can only take about 200 micrograms of folic acid a day. So we can't process more than that. One piece of bread actually has about 200 micrograms of folic acid in it. So we're overloading our bodies with this substance that we can't break down. So instead, you have to have methylfolate and folinic acid. It allows your body to break it down, and you're able to use it and get the value and benefit of it. As a matter of fact, they did some studies to see if folic acid would drop the neural tube defects, and it came back that it did in several places. So you look at southern states that typically aren't known for our diets down here. We saw where the neural tube defects actually dropped, but in California, they leveled out or even went up just a hair. So some would suggest that maybe it's because in California, they were already getting more folate through green leafy vegetables. They were eating more whole foods than we were in the South at the time. So that could be one explanation for why you saw neural tube defects fall in the South, but you didn't in some other areas around the world or the country.
Mm-hmm. That's so fascinating. The one thing that's hard, I feel like, with all of these, with basically everything, is like you said, there's good intent there. So it's like, okay, we know that this can maybe help decrease this. And then it's put out there and everything's kind of a short-term study. They're not like, hey, we're going to put folic acid out there and study it over the next 40 years before we start putting it into all the prenatals, into adding it to basically everything, cereals, breads, pastas, like you said, just like everything. And so then it's kind of proven safe in a short-term study, but time has kind of showed over and over again that maybe it helped in this area, but then it's causing a consequence in another area. And that's the hard thing of like weighing pros and cons. And it's like, okay, so I need this thing to help me, but if I take it too long or too much or too whatever, like it could have this outcome. And I feel like that's where most of us who are taking vitamins and supplements have zero knowledge on. So blindly just pumping ourselves with whatever vitamins could maybe help in some areas, but also could potentially harm in others.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because if you go to fertility clinics up until last year, I think, I can't remember when the study came out, it may have been 2020, 2021, but obviously COVID has changed years. I feel like I'm in dog years now.
Right.
But with that, there was a study that came out that said the old way of doing things within fertility clinics really should be changed. What they used to suggest is ramping up folic acid to about 5 milligrams per day, which is about 5 times more than what they recommend for normal pregnancies. Instead, they've said, look, you can't do that anymore. That's obsolete, but you should be instead getting 2 to 5 milligrams of methylfolate or folinic acid. So they're starting to catch up with some of that because they see the downside and the consequences to folic acid. And my hope is we can continue to educate people to get to that point and that level that it can catch on with the OBGYN boards and other things like that, that then OBGYNs will be able to take it on and really start helping their patients. Right now, I think part of the issue is a doctor delivers a baby and that baby's healthy to them during that 2 days that they're dealing with them, but they don't see the downriver consequences of what has happened with the allergies, with the asthma, and everything else that tends to prop up years down the road when they're no longer their patient. So they see them then, they see that they're healthy and they go, well, folic acid was perfectly fine for them. And I think that's one of our biggest issues and biggest uphill climbs that we have.
Yeah, it's nice that the infertility people are like starting to see, like just after the study, like starting to see the changes, because it's been shown too that it can take 20 years for something that's been in research and scientifically proven to actually make its way into the community. And we see that in the birthing world a lot of, because I work as a birth doula, you'll see a study coming out saying, basically, like I just did this post on Instagram about eating and drinking in labor and how like that's such an outdated philosophy based on when they did general anesthesia. They weren't like doing stomach acids to reduce that stuff. And basically the studies and research and everything shows that it's pretty safe. So you should be able to do that, but you're still not seeing it implemented, even though this research came out now almost 20 years ago saying that it is. But I was just at a birth last month that they told her she could only have ice chips. And I'm like, are we back in the 1940s when this came about? Like, what is happening? So it takes a long time. So it's nice to see that some clinics are already like wanting to make that change.
I totally agree. And I think we need to always remind ourselves, you know, it was in the 40s and 50s when they said it's still okay to smoke when you're pregnant.
Right.
So it took quite a while for us to catch on to that. So just because the medical community isn't saying one thing doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right thing to do. And to your point, 20 years later, they started to catch the idea that, hey, maybe smoking during pregnancy isn't such a good idea and not such a good thing. So I always go back to that one to say, look, we haven't always had it right. And what seems like common sense to us now with smoking, hopefully in 20 years, the same will be said about folic acid and folate.
Right. This is like just kind of a funny side note. Because when you have a kid, everybody like wants to give you advice and wants to pass down their knowledge. But again, so much has changed, right? And not that my husband's aunt has ever, she's never like given me unsolicited parenting advice, but we love to joke with her because her daughter's 41. And when she brought her home from the hospital, she was holding her in her lap in the front seat, smoking a cigarette out the car window. And we're like, you literally brought your baby home, not in a car seat, smoking
That's
a
right.
cigarette out the window. Like, you cannot tell me anything like
That's right.
what to do with my kids, which, like I said, she hasn't. She's hilarious and she's a good time, but we just like to joke around about that because we're like, what? Like,
That's right. But we were told then, or our parents were told then, that was not a big deal. That's the way you're supposed to do it. And you see a lot of that now. And, one of those things that I think you mentioned, the folic acid piece, one thing I wanted to touch on that I really found out that I didn't know much about was the MTHFR piece. And what they found was folic acid can't be broken down if you have this gene mutation called MTHFR. We all have MTHFR. It's a gene that we all have, but some of us, studies suggest 40 to 60% of the population have some form of this gene mutation. And if you have it, it means that you can't break down that folic acid at all. The only way to overcome that is through actually taking methylfolate or folinic acid, because it bypasses where that gene mutation takes place. And you're able to get folate into your system, which I think is one of the reasons you could see somebody in California, or those numbers in California, after they started the supplementation of folic acid, you didn't see the numbers fall because you were still having neural tube defects in that area, because you still had a percentage of the population who couldn't break down folic acid. And that is a bigger issue than I think a lot of doctors want to give credit to, I guess, when it comes to fertility. I don't know how familiar you are with MTHFR. I certainly was not very familiar with it prior to taking a deep dive into it, but MTHFR really checks off a lot of boxes on what we do, especially in pregnancy. So MTHFR, if it's not functioning correctly, means that you can't produce red blood cells, means you can't synthesize DNA or RNA. And those three pieces are really what's going on in a woman when she's pregnant. You are building all sorts of DNA, you're building all types of red blood cells because you're creating a new human within your womb at that time. And if you can't do that, then it's not long before that baby can't thrive and you end up having miscarriage. And they have found that time and again that MTHFR is a huge factor in infertility and fertility clinics. So I don't know how much more you want to dive in to that, but there are a lot of things that we could dive into about what really affects that gene. And some of this stuff I'm sure you're very aware of, and we've all heard, like environmental toxins. So if you're in a house with molds, that can cause that gene to not process the way it's supposed to. If you're under lots of stress, and most people who are going through fertility issues are under a great deal of stress because they want to be pregnant and the husband wants their wife to be pregnant. And then you have marital tensions, and then you have job issues, and you have just life in general. So we know that the more stress there is, the less functioning your MTHFR gene is. It starts to put stress on that MTHFR gene. The same is true if you're physically fit to the point that you are training all the time. So, a lot of intense people who train for either marathons or triathlons or just are working out all the time, that burns up all the methylation that's going on that MTHFR is a part of, that allows neurotransmitters to be built. So depression, anxiety, all those things tie into that. And then, of course, there are medications like methotrexate, antacids, all those affect the way that gene is expressed, and your diet. So if you eat lots of processed foods, that's also a bad thing. The good thing about all of those is you can control your environment to a certain degree. You can control the medications that you take, or at least know what's going on. You can start putting into place some of the measures to reduce stress, and you can get more rest after you work out. But the one that's the hardest is really that gene mutation that I talked about. And that's where you either are tested for it, or you start looking to see what those signs are to see if you may be suffering from that gene mutation. And, some of the interesting things with that is we know that if you have it, your body is going to be running about 20 to 70% efficiency of what it could be or what it should be, what somebody who doesn't have that gene mutation has. And you can either have a heterozygous form, and what that means is you get that gene mutation either from your mom alone or from your dad alone, or you can have a homozygous mutation, which means that your mom and dad decided to give you a gift that just keeps on giving the rest of your life, amongst other gifts that we always get from our parents, or that we give to our kids even. But the beauty of it is you can be tested for it. The downside is a lot of insurance companies aren't really paying for that anymore. So it's really more of a cash pay scenario. So you have to find the right people. You can do some research and find it. I found it for as cheap as about $200 at some places, but I've seen it as much as $500 to get tested for it. And it's a scenario that it may just be cut out the folic acid and start taking methylfolate and folinic acid and really watch your diet and see what happens. And you don't have to be tested at that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there was like so much to unpack in there. Does it just affect, so the MTHFR plays on folate. So that is the way, and you've said methylfolate a lot. So it's how we methylate things, which affects your
Correct.
detoxing and everything like that. So when you're saying like cutting out folic acid, all these different things, so that'd be really looking at the foods that it's added to, the vitamins that you're taking, and cutting those things out and seeing if it makes a difference. Then is there really a need to add, because we produce folate on our own, correct?
You get most of it through your diet. So
Okay.
your leafy
Like kale,
greens,
right?
yeah, kale, any of your spinaches, kale, lettuces, that's where you get the majority of it, but it's also in fruits that we eat. So you'll get it from that. And really, if you have a good diet, you should be able to get a good bit of what you need. Now, once you're pregnant, it becomes much harder and probably more expensive. And with as busy as most people are, it's difficult to keep up with that. So that's where I would certainly recommend supplementing, or if you know that you've got MTHFR gene mutation itself, maybe supplementing to help get you stabilized and up to where you need to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've never actually done a test for it. I did work with a doctor who we did tons of different labs because I was having some gut stuff going on. And I know that my dad and my sister have it. And he said, based on like what he saw, he's like, it looks like you methylate beautifully, but we didn't do like a specific test for that. And I'm curious, like if that would affect anything, or if I can just start paying attention more to what I'm eating.
Yeah.
But actually my pediatrician's office does it, which we haven't tested our daughter for it, but it was just like interesting because I know that they do it there, but insurance doesn't cover it if you want to get it done.
That's right. And with the advent of the internet and everything else being online with all the labs and things, you can certainly go there and do some research to find a lab that may be a little bit cheaper. You just have to send it through the mail. And I would always recommend doing that, especially with something like that that's not covered by insurance.
Mm-hmm. So just kind of to overview everything. So having too much folic acid could contribute to potentially like food allergies.
In your
and
kids.
Stuff like that. Right,
yes.
Right. What about like other allergies? Do you know anything about eczema?
Eczema would be one as well, that it could certainly be a part of how it's expressed in somebody who's suffering from that. So those would be the big things. And then any respiratory allergies that you might have, they have tied it into that as well.
Yeah, interesting. I'm like convinced my daughter has some sort of like underlying gut something going on because she has some eczema like on her arms. And my husband has it too. And he and I both have gut issues. So we're like, either we blessed her with that or like
That's right.
whatever. But also she was in the NICU the first week of her life on 2 different antibiotics. So I like during pregnancy, I pumped myself up with, I was eating good probiotic rich foods. I was taking probiotics. I was doing everything right. I didn't need any antibiotics in my birth, but then she ended up in the NICU. So I'm like, oh, we're just like wiping her gut completely out. And now we have to, try to replenish it. And so I feel like because she's turning 2 soon. And that started happening like the last 6 months. It like came out on her arm. She had some on her legs. That's gone now, but it's just like on her arms. And I'm like, oh no. Because like for me, I'm not okay with the answer of like, because I talked to our pediatrician about it, I love our pediatrician. They're really great. And she was like, yeah, it looks like eczema. You can do a steroid cream. And I'm like, yeah, but there's an underlying issue. Like, I'm not okay with just like the topical solution. I truly believe that something else is going on. And so I feel like I need to like find the answer of why this is happening.
Absolutely. And I think you're dead on with going down the gut issue, because we've heard lots and lots of stuff in recent years about how antibiotics can affect the gut, and all of it's tied together. I mean, MTHFR has some gut issues that it ties into as well. So I think you're dead on and going down that route and that path. And for too long, I think we have allowed ourselves to step back from our own medical care and taking that instead of taking the personal responsibility or the responsibility for our kids and stepping up to the plate and saying, hey, they've got a problem and it's bigger than what you're telling me, and I want to know more. And I think if we do that and we begin to be more proactive with our health, things will change within our health, and I think things would change within the medical community as well. Some doctors may not be happy about that, but that's what they're there for. They're there to practice medicine and help us deal with the health issues that we have. And if you have a doctor who's not willing to do that, who frowns upon you if you're doing that, then I highly recommend you find somebody new who you can work with and make sure that you can walk through some of these things with them until you're satisfied with the answer of what you got.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. You have to be your own advocate, and you're
Absolutely.
the only person living in your body 24/7. Like, what you might not know technically what's going on, but you can tell when something's off.
Absolutely.
I know that I've been off for a while, so I've been telling my husband, like, I gotta go work with somebody again because I've been having lots of gut issues lately, and I didn't for like a few years. And now after my second kid, I'm like, I'm a disaster. So I'm like, I need
Yep.
to, first of all, do the things that are in my control, my diet and stuff like that. I think having two under two is like chaos sometimes. And
That's
I
right.
know
You're
that
just
when
happy to be
I'm
alive.
right, I'm like, nobody died, the house didn't burn down.
Yep.
But also I know that when I'm tired, I know that when I'm stressed, I crave sugar. And instead of turning to that, I just need to be like, why don't you eat more protein, more fat? Because that also helps satisfy it. But or make something at home. Like last night I sliced bananas, put them in the freezer, and then took them out and put nut butter on them, then froze it again. And then I made like homemade chocolate with cacao powder and coconut oil, and like drizzled it on there, then froze it again. And I was like, this is probably not going to cut it. I'm just going to like want to eat a cookie after this, but it actually curbed my craving. And I was like,
That's
perfect.
awesome.
Like, I just need to do more of this.
That's right.
And not just eat pure sugar, which I have been doing. So, so do the things that are in my control, and then like get help outside of
That's
that,
right.
because I definitely have gut issues going on.
Well, and I think what you said really takes me down the path of where I like to go with MTHFR, is an understanding that our bodies, and if you have MTHFR, are a lot like a car. So your car gives you warning lights. Either you hear the loud knocking where it says check engine. Well, I think our bodies do very similar things. A car can run on about 40% the level of oil that it needs. It still runs, but it overheats really quick. The engine starts to break down really fast. And likewise, our bodies can run on things that we aren't familiar with, especially in MTHFR, where we're not maybe getting the full methylfolate or folate allowance in our diet. And we can run for a while, but eventually it catches up to us, kind of that same overheating. And some of the telltale signs with your body, especially with MTHFR, and in your case, gut health or whatever, it's inability to sleep. You get increased anxiety, you get depression. All those things are signs that maybe MTHFR is there, that brain fog. So maybe you're not able to think about things. It seems like I've had that all my life. ADD, headaches, all those things can certainly be signs that, hey, something's going on. That increased pain sensitivity, where maybe at some point you were able to take pain to greater levels, but now everything that you do hurts. Joint stiffness, all those things are really good signs that it's there. Within pregnancy itself, if you're talking about that, multiple miscarriages are a sign that you may have MTHFR. PCOS or polycystic ovary syndrome is a sign. Depression obviously is one. Infertility, Down syndrome, and cleft palate children can be a sign that maybe you had MTHFR during your pregnancy. Two of them, obviously, you can't control until afterwards, but prior to that, you could.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's super interesting. Yeah, I'll have to get tested. And I know like one thing that I always try to get like pretty healthy before we start trying to conceive. And I know once our youngest is 1, she'll be 1 next March, we'll want to try again. But I told my husband, I'm like, this time, like, I really want to, like 6 months out, really start working on our health. And one thing that makes me super nervous to start trying again is every single time I've gotten pregnant, we got pregnant right away and I had a miscarriage. So I'm like really nervous about that, because the last time was like, I thought I was over it. And then I just passed like the year anniversary of it happening. And I'm actually taking a course to become a bereavement doula to help others like through that loss. And I was like reading it and just like bawling the other night. And I'm like, oh my gosh, there's like still grief there. And that scares me to go through that again. I'm like, I don't want to get excited again just to have experienced loss again. But I also know that there's like a lot of other things that can contribute to it as well. But it's just like super interesting to know that that could be a factor, and just kind of paying attention to that folic acid versus methylfolate could be a contributing factor. So
and
definitely something I'll look into.
One thing that you mentioned that I think was key that a lot of people don't think about, as you said, we need to get our health together. Most people think just on the female side that that's who has to have the health up, that you need to be taking the folate, that you need to do all those things. But they've actually shown in studies that men are just as important and just a big a part of this. If they have MTHFR and they pass that on, there is still a higher chance for miscarriage if the man passes that gene on. So you could maybe not have MTHFR, but your husband could. There's still a high chance for a miscarriage because he's got the MTHFR gene that he's passing down. So it's hugely important, especially for some of your listeners who may be going to fertility clinics or donating eggs and trying to get to that level. Once you get to that level, they now recommend, there was a study that came out in recent years that recommend it's not just the female that needs to be tested for MTHFR, but it's the male that needs to be tested as well, and really focusing on both of your health prior to conceiving, because that is a huge component of whether you're going to be able to sustain a pregnancy throughout the process.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so much that goes into it. And like you said, with a huge amount of the population, I mean, potentially 50% having this gene mutation, it definitely could go like help knowing whether you have it or not. But it's also interesting that so many people have it, but yet we're still seemingly having pretty healthy babies. So it's not always like this
Yes.
scary situation. Like if you have it, you're going to have a miscarriage or going to have something go wrong.
Absolutely. And I think to your point, we we have some amazing bodies that are designed to bypass that MTHFR. So you've got within methylation, there are backup generators, if you will, for our bodies to produce the folate or to produce the methyl groups that you need to create those neurotransmitters, the red blood cells and everything else. And as a matter of fact, if it depends on which form you have. So there are two different forms. You've got C677T and A1298C. So they sound very confusing and they kind of get you all glassy eyed when you hear that. But all that means is the 677 and the 1298 is where it falls on the gene sequence. So they've gone in, somebody much smarter than me has gone in and sequenced where all these genes are, and they've said that's where those are. If you have the C677T by itself, heterozygous, there's about a 30% reduction in your methylation that's going on. So you're not going to be operating at 100%, but that 30% is still going to affect you. It may cause you to have more fatigue, but it may not cause a miscarriage. Now, if you're homozygous for that, you get it from both your mom and dad, they're showing up to 70% reduction. And that's when you have to have a lot more concern. You have to look at it a little bit more, and you really have to spend some time making sure that you're getting your diet right and everything else. I recommend it for everybody because you want to be as healthy as possible and you want your baby to be as healthy as possible. But definitely if you're homozygous for C677T, you want to look for that. And then they also have one where you could get the A1298C from your mom and the C677T from your dad, or vice versa. And that says that you're getting about 50% of what your body really needs through that pathway. So that's why you want to be sure that if you're getting tested, you're getting tested for both of those gene sequences. And if you have the C677T and you're homozygous, you definitely need to watch out for it, because you could be anywhere from 20% to 70% what your body needs to be producing. If you're at the 20%, to your point, you may not feel any effects. The child, your baby may not feel any effects, but you could be so much better if you're supplementing with methylfolate and avoiding the folic acid. And, you know, you could almost be Supergirl if you wanted to be, if you're eating the right things and doing the right things, if you're performing at a high level already.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So once we have kids, like we always want to try to keep them as healthy as possible and ourselves. And I feel like I didn't get sick for years, and then I had kids, and then I've been sick twice this year. I feel like part of that too was like not doing a lot with COVID. I had my first daughter in 2020, so we were locked down. Then had my second daughter this spring, and just kind of like getting back out into the world. And I ended up getting sick twice. And I know another thing that you like to talk about is how to naturally kind of boost our immunity and fight off viruses. Because I definitely wasn't, correct me if I'm wrong, like kind of like when it comes to more natural things, you want to take it like your first onset of symptoms. Like, okay, I feel this coming on, I need to start taking this. And I didn't do that because for years, like I said, I just didn't take, I'm like, I'm not going to the doctor. I feel a little whatever, it'll be gone in a few days and I'd be fine. But I actually like was under the weather this year. Like Mother's Day, I was miserable. I was so sick. I'm like, man, like sitting on the couch in my pajamas all day long. And I'm like, this is not how I pictured this day. I mean, I pictured doing nothing, but not feeling like crap.
Yeah, exactly.
So what are some of those ways that we can do that?
Yeah, I think obviously immune health has taken a huge front seat these last couple of years. To your point with COVID and everything else, it's something that we've started looking at a lot more in depth. And we're all familiar with vitamin C and the fact that vitamin C certainly helps us and gets us where we need to go. But again, it's all based on that personal responsibility of making sure that A, our diet is right, because the same things we talked about with MTHFR affect our immune health as well. So if we're eating the right things, we're reducing processed foods, we're not exposing ourselves to the environmental toxins that may be in our houses or places where we work, then we give our body a much greater chance of fighting off something that's foreign when it comes there, because it's not having to focus on those environmental toxins or the processed foods that we can't deal with. It's now able to fully vent itself against these invaders that have come into our bodies, the viruses, the bacteria, whatever it may be. So with that said, there are certain things we can do from a supplementation standpoint that will help us help put us in the best seat possible when a virus or a bacteria is introduced to our body. One of the ones that I think we've learned the most about in the last few years is quercetin. Quercetin is something that actually comes from an apple. And I think maybe that's where we get the old adage, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. Not sure, but they should have changed it, because to get the amount of quercetin you need about 25 apples a day.
Easy.
So yeah, that's not a problem. That's all we do all day is eat apples, apparently.
Exactly.
But a medium apple gets about 10 milligrams of quercetin in it, and you need about 250 to 500 milligrams per day in order to really get that up. But what they found is that quercetin is a natural antiviral, and it also works as what's called a zinc ionophore. And what that means is zinc can't get inside the cells without hitching a ride on something. And quercetin is that vehicle that it hitches a ride on to get inside the cell, and then allows zinc to really start to destroy the bacteria and viruses that have gotten inside those cells. So quercetin works as an antiviral by itself, but then when you combine it with zinc, it really begins to ramp up your body's ability to fight off any type of bacteria or viral infection that may be out there. And there are tons of studies out there about really how it works. It actually works as a shield to begin with. So it keeps the virus from getting into the body through our skin and other ways. But then once it's in the body, it keeps it from multiplying. So it tries to isolate that virus within your body. And then if it does multiply and start to get loose of that, it actually keeps that virus from attaching to those cells, and then works with zinc to help get it inside the cells to start destroying things. And quercetin has a lot of other attributes to it that are beneficial to us, but I think the immune health is really the biggest piece that we can run with on that.
Mm-hmm. Is
And
it
then
like,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. Oh, is it like something that, because it helps immune health, and we want to make sure that our immune system's working properly. So are these things that you should be taking regularly, or just when you're feeling during cold and flu season, or like when you feel like you might be coming down with something?
If you've got it, I think it works a lot like vitamin C, or it does work a lot like vitamin C. So quercetin, vitamin C, zinc, if you already have it in your body and it's already in your cells, then that's helping fight against it. It keeps it from even getting into your body. So I always recommend that you take something like that, regardless of what season it is. You can maybe drop back on the amount that you're taking during non-flu seasons, non-COVID seasons, if that is such a thing these days, or non-cold seasons. But once you get into those, I always recommend upping that amount and maybe doubling your intake of it. And the beauty of it is, even if you're not worried about the immune health side, with quercetin in particular, and zinc and vitamin C and vitamin D, you get that antioxidant flow. So you're able to destroy the free radicals and those other chemicals and toxins that are getting inside your body. So it's working against those. They help to reduce inflammation. So it's not just the immune health that you're getting, you're actually getting a lot of benefits other than that. As a matter of fact, for the past 30 years with quercetin, there have been a lot of ENTs who use that for allergies. So it has a strong ability to reduce your allergies, and it acts as an anti-allergy, kind of a natural allergen or antihistamine, if you will, that you can use during your allergic season. So some people take it during the fall and it helps fight off things, or at least keeps them from being as bad. And a lot of people take it during pollen season as well.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. I feel like as I get older, my allergies get worse.
I think they do. I think they do. And a lot of that's probably because we're exposed to it more, and then our body gets desensitized to it and we have to ramp it up.
Yeah. I've never had them super bad, but well, I guess this year I thought I had allergies and it was way worse. I didn't get tested for anything, but my youngest, poor thing, she was like 2 months old and she had 2 different strains of the flu and she was sick for like a month and it was awful. Like I said, with my oldest, we like didn't go anywhere, do anything. So she never got sick. And then my youngest was 2 months old, sick for a month. And it was like the worst thing ever, like hearing your little baby like coughing and just so stuffed up. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. So what I thought was allergies at first ended up being something way different.
And there's nothing worse than seeing a baby that you don't know what they're doing. You don't really know what they're having. All you hear are those little things, and it just kind of freaks you out a little bit.
Right. And like I said, me, who's somebody who like never goes to the doctor, we went to the pediatrician 3 times in that month. I'm like,
that's right.
Can we come back in? Can we just make sure everything, because I was so scared about like RSV or like anything like that. And so I'm like, yep, we're back again.
and with good reason, because RSV has really reared its ugly head in the last couple of years. It seems like it's become more commonplace and you hear a lot about it. So I think wisely you were going back in and checking and making sure.
Yeah, definitely. You become different when you have kids versus like what you do for yourself, but taking care of your own health does affect your children's health. And so that's why conversations like these are so important, because you get to learn that. And I do think whatever we can do to help out. And again, that piece of getting both of your health in order. And one example is, which I've talked on here before, about how men who drink a lot of alcohol, their kids are more likely to have congenital heart defects. So that really does play into the health of your children. So instead of just you cutting out alcohol and like getting healthy, like your partner needs to too get healthy with you, because it really does affect the health of your children.
Absolutely.
Well, I just want to thank you so much for coming on here. I know that you have supplements, and I'd love for you to touch on that before we wrap up. Like maybe tell us a little bit why you have a prenatal, why that would be different than another one that we might see somewhere else, and then where people can find and order that at.
Absolutely. We've got a product called Bump DHA, and we designed it with a maternal fetal medicine, basically a high-risk pregnancy doctor, who came in and told us that people were getting too much folic acid. So the idea was take out the folic acid and only have methylfolate and folinic acid in it, and really concentrate on the things that are happening during pregnancy, which are DNA synthesis and red blood cell synthesis. So you're creating DNA, you're creating red blood cells, and that's what this supplement was designed to do. Most of your prescription prenatals, they have to have 1 milligram of folic acid in it in order to be prescription. That doesn't necessarily mean it's better. The reason it's a prescription is because it covers up what's called pernicious anemia, and you don't know if you have a B12 deficiency, because folic acid masks that ability to see that. So they have to be under a doctor's supervision in order to see that happening. So with ours, you don't have to have a prescription. We do recommend that you're under doctor's supervision or some type of health practitioner supervision during the taking of this, just so you are in line and in tune with what's going on with your body, and they can see what's happening. But they can go to centurionlabs.com. That's CENTURIONLABS.com. And they can look up Bump DHA, and their first bottle will give 67% off if they put in the code MAMA. and they'll get 67% off their first bottle. And then we also do have an immunity boost that has that quercetin in it. It has vitamin D, zinc, vitamin C, and copper, because one of the big things that you see in a lot of immune health supplements is you've got zinc, but you don't have copper. And if you have that, you deplete your copper levels, and it can create an inverse relationship where you may have lots of zinc, but if you don't have the copper, you end up defeating the purpose of it. You can destroy your immune health by not having enough copper as well. So they can go there and get their first bottle of Defender at centurionlabs.com for 67% off as well.
Awesome. So, I will have that in the show notes. I'll have to order some of that Defender because I like to have stuff like that on hand.
Absolutely.
Too, just because I'm still taking, like, I'll check out your prenatal as well. I'm still taking that just because I'm 4 months postpartum. And so just making sure that I'm filling in gaps in my diet, because I know that there are gaps for sure.
Yes.
So I'm still taking that, but it's nice. I like to have things like the Defender or whatever on hand, especially if we're going to a family reunion, we're going to be traveling. It's just nice to have stuff to support that immune system when you know that you're going to be stressing it out a little bit extra. Or if we feel like we're getting sick, I'm always like, okay, let's pump up all the vitamins and do all of this. So, but then it sucks when you don't have it on hand, because it's like by the time then you order it and it comes in, you're already deep in it.
That's right.
That's so right. You gotta have it on hand. But I just want to thank you so much, Troy, for coming on and for having this conversation. Like I said, we've never talked about the MTHFR before, and I know that this was a lot of information that, like, we really dove into it. So if you have to kind of rewind and listen back or write down, like, wait, what are the two different strains? What are the whatever? But I'd be super curious for those listening, if you have gotten tested, if you know that you have it. I know, like I said, people in my family who have it, who got their kids tested, who have it, different things like that. So it's just a super interesting thing to take into consideration, to look at when you're going over your overall health. And it might just be the missing piece that you've been looking for health-wise, whether you're experiencing the brain fog or miscarriages or whatever. It might just be that missing piece. I know a couple of people that I know that they know that they for sure have it, really struggle with the brain fog and depression piece of it. And I know for me, like I don't know what that feels like when this person like describes it to me. I'm like, I feel like I don't have brain fog. It's more like mom brain, but like, I know that that's like an actual thing.
That's a real thing. Yeah.
Right. That people really struggle with. And this person I know has this, they got tested for it, but I don't think that they've done they haven't taken any steps to like do anything with it. But like I said, yeah, it could be that missing piece. So just kind of getting an awareness on your overall health can do nothing but help. So I just want to thank you so much for coming on and sharing all your wisdom with us.
No, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.